in a few moments and a few other various selected passages this morning as we talk about the fact that he is risen. The outline is also on a purple sheet in your worship folder if you'd like to fill in the blanks there. Have you ever stood at the graveside of someone you loved? I know many of you have. And last spring I had the opportunity for the first time to go to my dad's graveside and see the stone that my mom and my brother and I had picked out for my dad. And I stood there thinking about just about his life and about his faith, about his integrity, and about the fact that our relationship was over in a real sense. I know my dad will be raised at the last day, but I know that on earth I can't really talk to him anymore, and that relationship is not there. I don't know about you, but I always had it in the back of my mind, if all else fails, I can go talk to my dad. And you miss that. It's kind of like that security's gone. And, our security should be in God anyway, but there's something about that relationship with your dad that you miss. And I know you have that with other family members or spouses. And so there's a sense, of sadness. Well, I really believe that was starkly present in the lives of the disciples and the followers of Jesus after Jesus was crucified. There was fear and confusion, considering the fact that Jesus not only died, but he died by crucifixion, and some of them watched it. This was the most cruel and painful kind of capital punishment that the Romans had available for their worst of criminals. And you would think that killing Jesus, crucifying him on the cross, would be enough for the religious leaders that they would no longer feel threatened. Because that's, their position. They felt threatened by Jesus. And yet, after they had arrested him, they got him tried by the Roman authorities, got him crucified by Pilate, they still are concerned that this small band of followers are going to somehow convince people that he had raised from the dead, and that he was the long-awaited Messiah. The religious leaders feared Jesus even after they killed him. They were still worried. And so we read in Matthew 27, beginning with verse 62, we read these words. The next day, the one after the preparation, the chief priests and Pharisees went to Pilate. Sir, they said, we remember that while he was still alive, that deceiver said, after 3 days I will rise again. So give the order for the tomb to be made secure until the 3rd day. Otherwise his disciples may come and steal the body and tell the people that he has been raised from the dead. This last deception will be worse than the first. Take a guard, Pilate answered. Go make the tomb as secure as you know how. So they went and made the tomb secure by putting a seal on the stone and posting the guard. So the guard was posted. They put this wax seal that would indicate if the stone had been moved or tampered with in any way. And as much as Jesus' followers wanted to believe in Jesus, at this point, they didn't have any hope. They had just gone through the saddest day in their life, and they had watched Jesus die between two criminals, and they didn't believe there was any hope at this point. See, they were stuck in that lower story that we've been talking about. We're doing the story, a condensed version of the Bible, a survey in 31 weeks, and they were stuck in that lower story. They didn't see the upper story of God's sovereign plan and how he was working through all of these events. And many of them felt pretty foolish at this point, I think. They seemed to really have no hope that this Messiah could help them any longer, that he wasn't able to deliver them. They had hoped he would deliver them from the Roman domination at that time. But at this point, maybe the religious teachers were right. Maybe Jesus wasn't who he claimed to be. The prophets had said the Messiah would be a mighty God, an everlasting Father, Prince of Peace in Isaiah 9:6, but not a humble man in a robe with sandals who would be crucified and couldn't even save himself. So Jesus' followers were fearful and they were grieving. The day after Jesus was crucified was the Jewish Sabbath, or Saturday, a day when people went to the temple, but then they pretty much just stayed in their homes. And Jesus' followers, they must have been home, scared to death. No hope, no courage, no hopes for the future. And they just believed that this was it. Jesus was dead. And of course, everyone dies. And we try to avoid the reality of death, don't we? We try many times not to talk about it. And we try to avoid the reality. The death of a loved one, it's a grief, a time of grief. It's a painful thing for us. And the violent death that Jesus saw that week and went through, it was terrible. And they were grieving. I can't help but think of those families in Brussels right now who are grieving right today because of what happened in those violent terrorist attacks at the airport and at the train station. They're grieving today. Mary Magdalene and the other Mary went to the tomb in grief. In Matthew 28:1, we read, "After the Sabbath, at dawn, on the first day of the week, Mary Magdalene and the other Mary went to look at the tomb." Now, both Marys were in grief. They loved Jesus. He had done wonderful things for them. And they go to pay their final respects. And so you can imagine the shock when they come and the tomb is empty. And they come to what appears to be the only logical conclusion, is that somebody has stolen the body. And they don't understand. You'd think they would have remembered the times at this point where Jesus had clearly said that after 3 days he would rise again. But that was the furthest thing from their minds. Who would be thinking about that at this point? They weren't, obviously. And I'll read the account in Matthew 28, beginning with verse 2. "There was a violent earthquake, for an angel of the Lord came down from heaven, and going to the tomb, rolled back the stone and sat on it. His appearance was like lightning, and his clothes were white as snow. The guards were so afraid of him that they shook and became like dead men. The angel said to the women, 'Do not be afraid, for I know that you are looking for Jesus who was crucified. He is not here, He is risen, just as he said. Come and see the place where he lay. Then go quickly and tell his disciples, he is risen from the dead and is going ahead of you into Galilee. There you will see him. Now I have told you." So the women hurried away from the tomb, afraid, yet filled with joy, and ran to tell his disciples. Suddenly Jesus met them. "Greetings," he said. They came to him, clasped his feet, and worshiped him. Then Jesus said to them, "Do not be afraid. Go and tell my brothers to go to Galilee. There they will see me." Wow. The phrase in that passage that always strikes me is that they were afraid yet filled with joy. Afraid yet filled with joy. Isn't that often how we feel? When we think about Jesus, when we think about having faith, when we think of giving our lives to him, following him, we're afraid. I know when I first came to faith in Jesus Christ, that was my response. I was afraid because I thought, what is all this involved, really, to follow him? And yet I was filled with joy, unspeakable peace that I was forgiven and that I had a new life in Christ. And you know, to be honest, that's kind of the same afraid and filled with joy when I asked my wife to marry me and she said yes. You know, we weren't getting along the best right then. She thought I was going to break up with her, I think, that night. And I thought, well, you know, if she's the one, she's going to say yes. It's not that things are going so great right now. And I was afraid, but filled with joy when she said yes. Imagine these two women. They know Jesus was just crucified. Now they see him alive. It's a scary thing. What in the world is going on? But what a wonderful thing. If this is true. Imagine that Jesus actually appears to women as the first ones he would appear to and reveal himself to, and uses them as the first witnesses to go tell. See, in that society, women were second class. This was not the politically correct thing to do. If you wanted to communicate a message, something new, to first communicate it to to women. But see, Jesus didn't do what was politically correct. He never did. He didn't do what was socially acceptable. He had a high regard for women. Salvation and love from God is not any less for whether we're male or female, whether we're black or white, or whether we're rich or poor. He didn't care. He saw the soul of people, and he still does. And he cares for everyone equally. Well, on the same day, Jesus appears to the two Marys. Jesus appears to two grieving disciples on the road to Emmaus. Luke tells us that in Luke's account. In Luke 24, beginning with verse 15. As they talked and discussed these things, these two men, one Cleopas, Jesus himself came up and walked along with them, but they were kept from recognizing him. He asked them, "What are you discussing together as you walk along?" They stood still, their faces downcast. One of them, named Cleopas, asked him, "Are you the only visitor to Jerusalem who does not know the things that have happened there in these days?" "What things?" he asked. Now they're just simply amazed that someone near Jerusalem would not know about the fact that Jesus of Nazareth had been crucified. And so they're kind of shocked by that. And So Jesus gives them a quick history lesson from the Old Testament about that these things were going to take place. And yet they don't get it. And then Jesus really explains the upper story to them. And once they realize it's Jesus speaking, Jesus disappears, and they race back to Jerusalem to tell the disciples that the Lord is risen. And they shared this good news. And as they're sharing this good news with the disciples back in Jerusalem, and that was about a 7-mile jaunt to get back there, Jesus appears among them. And we see it in verse 36. While they were still talking about this, Jesus himself stood among them and said to them, "Peace be with you." They were startled and frightened, thinking they had seen a ghost. He said to them, "Why are you troubled? And why do you doubt? Do doubts rise in your minds? Look at my hands and my feet. It is I myself. Touch me and see. A ghost does not have flesh and bones, as you see I have." And then he went on to explain everything written in the law of Moses and the prophets, and how the Psalms had been fulfilled, and that they were to be witnesses to these things. Well, unfortunately, Thomas is missing. Now, we often call him Doubting Thomas. In verse 24 it says, "Now Thomas, also known as Didymus, one of the 12, was not with the disciples when Jesus came. So the other disciples told him, 'We have seen the Lord.' But he said to them, 'Unless I see the nail marks in his hands, and put my finger where the nails were, and put my hand into his side, I will not believe.'" Now, before we get, this better than thou attitude and, look down on Thomas for not believing, isn't it true that's where most of us are? In fact, at some point, that's where all of us are. We just can't believe this. And we want to see. We want some proof. And that's why I encourage people to always go and study the Bible for yourself. Don't take it from me. Don't take it from somebody else. Study the Bible for yourself. Study history. Study archaeology. We see all kinds of proofs about Jesus Christ if we're willing to get the facts. Check out the claims of Jesus Christ. And, rejecting the claims of Christ without study is like saying, is like really rejecting geometry or algebra and saying, "Well, I just don't get it. And I don't believe it's true. I don't believe it works." And if you haven't studied mathematics, that's just irrational. Just because you don't understand it and somebody told you it doesn't make sense, should you believe that? Jesus knows our doubts. He knows our struggles. He knows our past hurts and how they become obstacles to faith. And he doesn't get angry with us. He doesn't belittle Thomas for his doubts and for his wanting proof. In fact, later he appears to Thomas and he invites him to examine his wounds. And he says to him, "Stop doubting and believe." It's recorded in John 20, beginning with verse 26. A week later, his disciples were in the house, and Thomas was with them. And though the doors were locked, Jesus came and stood among them and said, "Peace be with you." Then he said to Thomas, "Put your finger here. See my hands. Reach your hand and put it into my side. Stop doubting and believe." Now you may be here today with a lot of doubts. You may be here with a lot of questions. That's okay. You know, there are a lot of people that don't have peace in their heart today. They don't have peace with a lot of people, not alone peace with God. And they're not sure they're forgiven. They're not sure that Jesus is alive. Well, I want to encourage you to pray for faith, to believe. To ask God for the faith to believe. Research, get facts, but then pray that the sovereign God of the universe would give you the faith you need to believe. Thomas was given the faith right then and there. Thomas said, "My Lord and my God." Now notice, belief is personal. Personal. My Lord, my God. You see, you can't go on the faith of your parents. You can't go on the faith of your spouse or somebody else. You have to have a personal faith in Jesus Christ yourself. In the Old Testament, God's people were carried into exile in Babylon because of their wickedness. And then God told his prophet, Jeremiah, to tell them he would listen to them if they prayed to him. In fact, in Jeremiah 29:8, he says, "Tell them, you will seek me and find me when you seek me with all your heart." That's it. We need to seek God with all our heart. Seeking God with all your heart is the point I had to come to. And it's the point every one of us at some point have to get to. And I hope you get to that point without having